Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. Let's go on our topic. About 9 years ago, just as I was about to start writing the content of this chapter, I suddenly came across the news of a 10-year-old girl in a certain city committing suicide by taking poison. In her suicide note, he said that the teacher wouldn't let her take the exam, so there was no point in living. Uh, Alas, this is another suicide case caused by strong environmental negation. If we consider suicide as a behavior, then the G wave that leads to this behavior is the strong activation of the self-abandonment G after the input of the environmental negation G wave. The intensity of the G wave released after a G is activated is related to the strength of this G and the degree of its activation, as well as the intensity of the G wave that activates this G. Once suicide occurs, the behavioral G wave that leads to suicide must win out in the vector effect and is necessarily strong. Then let's continue this analysis. Since the little girl committed suicide, we can deduce the following. First, the little girl must have a self-abandonment G in her heart, and this self-abandonment G is most likely relatively strong. Second, the environmental negation imposed by the teacher on her is most likely intense. The two most likely mentioned here can exist simultaneously, or only one of them can be present. So, how does the self-abandonment G come into being? Let's change the topic for a moment and talk about the protagonist in the experiment. In Pavlov's dog experiment, every time the bell rang and food was presented, the dog would come running with saliva dripping. If the bell rang but no food was given, after several such broken promises, the dog would not only stop salivating but also stop coming over. The dog's previous behavior of running over with saliva dripping was undoubtedly driven by the G wave that expected the appearance of food. That is, the expectation of getting a positive feedback from doing something driven the behavior. The dog's subsequent non-performance of this behavior is caused by the G wave that expects the non-appearance of food. That is, the expectation of getting zero feedback or negative feedback from doing something leads to the non-occurrence of the behavior. These two completely different expectations are generated and reshaped through continuous environmental experiences, thus influencing the generation of two different types of behavioral responses. Then, referring to the one behavior with multiple components and the divisibility, combinability. and multi-meaning nature of Ju we mentioned before, if we considered living as a large combined behavior, then when the suicide behavior does not occur, we can consider it as the appearance and continuation of this combined behavior. As an experience of the environment, the implementation of this combined behavior is like the dog running over with saliva dripping each time. The various positive and negative feedbacks from the environment are also reshaping the numerous subjects that generate this combined behavior at the moment. If we vectorially superimpose the various feedbacks in the environment, a combined feedback will also be formed. Then, whether to live or not is simplified to the effect of a certain type of feedback on the behavior. For behavior, like setting up a street store, if it is easy, comfortable, and highly profitable, would you not do it? But if you can't make money, endure large hunger and cold, be chased by urban management, and extorted by gangsters, would you still set up the store? The suicide behavior, essentially, is to terminate the living combined behavior. Its appearance means a relatively strong negative feedback expectation of the combined feedback. This negative feedback expectation is undoubtedly shaped by the living environment of the behavior subject. That is to say, the suicide victim has experienced enough negative feedback. Note that we have to mention the reasons within the suicide victim himself or herself here, because under different genetic traits, the feedbacks caused by the same environmental factors are not completely the same. Different genetic traits come from the environment of the behavior subject's ancestral evolution. From this perspective, as defenders of life, we should not only focus on the treatment of individuals or certain groups, but also pay attention to creating a social environment where high dose and high intensity negative feedback disappears. Moreover, this effort can bring benefits in the distant future. In the previous paragraph, we considered the suicide behavior as the termination of the living combined behavior. Similarly, as a behavior itself, its generation must have a positive feedback expectation that leads to this behavior. In a living environment full of negative feedback, the expectation of everything becoming silent in death, compared with the many negative feedback expectations of living, is positive in itself and make people yearn for it. If there's religious content in this environment, this content in religion about reaching the paradise or the afterlife of bliss can more easily make people have a positive feedback expectation of suicide. For example, the little girl at the beginning of this chapter mentioned in her suicide note that she would take good care of her parents in heaven. I quite agree with many other philosophical and benevolent views in religions. However, our previous deduction reveals the limitations of many religions, and what will make people extremely indignant are numerous cults. Cults often vigorously promote the idea of ascending to heaven after death, thus luring a large number of believers to harm their own lives. If you are a person who pursues the improvement of people's life experience and hates all behaviors that harm life, then you might as well seriously start studying my G theory and be committed to creating a social environment where high dose and high intensity negative feedback disappears. As for why we don't create a completely positive feedback only environment, this question can be used as a thought-provoking question. In the treatment of individuals, you yourself become an environmental factor. Don't underestimate your own power. A person struggling in the lake can be saved from drowning with just a piece of wood the size of a palm and can then continue to lead a wonderful life. And you are like a growing tree, much larger than a palm. Okay, everybody, that's the content today. How do you feel? Please leave the comment below. Thank you very much. See you next time. Bye bye.